It is debate night for the Democratic and Republican vice presidential nominees, and it comes as the Trump White House has morphed into a COVID-19 hotspot, an issue sure to be a prime topic tonight. Our White House correspondent Yamiche Alcindor begins our coverage.
Tonight's face-off in Salt Lake City is the first and only time that Vice President Pence and his Democratic challenger, California Senator Kamala Harris, will debate before the election. But the debate stage itself will feature a stark visual reminder of this historic pandemic year: plexiglass panels. The dividers are meant to create a protective barrier between the two. The Trump campaign, which has often ignored CDC social distancing guidelines, initially pushed back on the plexiglass, but the Biden campaign succeeded in getting them added. In fact, just 27 days until the election, positive coronavirus test results continue to plague the White House, with more than 24 cases, including at least 3 journalists who work there. Today, Chief of Staff Mark Meadows insisted the Trump administration is responding appropriately.
We've actually also done some additional protocols in terms of cordoning off different working groups.
The outbreak at the White House includes more than 10 of the president's family and close associates, with White House senior advisor Stephen Miller testing positive last night. Today, the White House doctor sent an update noting that President Trump is symptom-free and that he says he is, quote, feeling great. Later, as the Marines stood guard outside, the president, who is likely still contagious with the coronavirus, returned to the Oval Office. He held meetings and briefings with aides. But House Speaker Nancy Pelosi sharply criticized the White House's refusal to adhere to its own guidance.
I wouldn't go anywhere near the White House. It's one of the most dangerous places in the country, both in terms of the assault that it makes on truth as well as health. There's something wrong about the disconnect between what the president's responsibilities are and what's happening.
For its part, the Democratic ticket has taken increased campaign precautions. And Team Biden says it's the White House's responsibility to make others feel safe along the campaign trail, including at Biden's upcoming debate with President Trump in Miami.
There will be real people, there'll be citizens there in attendance asking questions. So the obligation is on Donald Trump to prove that he is not contagious. We have every expectation that he'll do that. And when he does, we're looking forward to being there to debate.
So even as the vice presidential candidates stay at least 12 feet apart tonight, the campaign's pandemic responses remain seemingly worlds apart.
And Yamiche joins me now, along with our Capitol Hill correspondent, Lisa Desjardins, who's also covering the Biden-Harris campaign. So, Yamiche, to you first. With this backtracking by the president, the White House now saying it's open to smaller, isolated bills. What do we know about why the president reversed himself and what looks possible?
Well, the president is eager now that he's really gotten a lot of backlash for calling off negotiations on this COVID-19 relief bill to try to say, yes, I am interested in doing something. And just a few moments ago, the president released a video from the White House saying that he feels like the coronavirus was really a blessing in disguise for him, because now he has ideas on what kind of treatments Americans can get. He said at one point that he feels like he had a cure for the virus. That, of course, we don't have any evidence for a cure of the virus, and the FDA hasn't approved any treatment, a final treatment for the coronavirus. But the president essentially is eager to say, I am still at work for the American people. Last night, when he sent that surprising tweet, essentially unilaterally saying, I'm going to call off these negotiations until after I win the election, there were a lot of people, including Republicans, who said, why are we the ones taking blame for this? The president now is saying that he wants to do some sort of piecemeal deals. He's looking at possibly doing a bill for the airline industry, as well as maybe doing stimulus checks for some Americans. But what's complicating this is that House Speaker Nancy Pelosi at one point was saying, why not do an airline bill? And House Republicans were the ones who were pushing back. So now the White House is essentially saying, after the president said, I didn't want to do a deal, he's now saying, well, let's do a small deal. But it's not clear whether or not Democrats will play ball, especially as the president is continuing to release videos as he's sick, really wanting to try to talk about the fact that his presidency is at work.
So, Lisa, to you, do we know how close the two sides had been to reaching an agreement? And is some sort of, or smaller, isolated bills, is that doable?
The two sides were much closer than they had been in May, but Judy, they still had a long way to go. I want to look at some graphics about where things stood on the coronavirus talks. First, here's the areas where the president and Democrats overlap. Too, as Yamiche mentioned, the $1,200 stimulus payments, that's something that the House passed in its versions of coronavirus relief, and then also $25 to $30 billion for airlines. Judy, the issue is, though, that the House Democrats feel that there is so much else that needs to be done now. Let's look at that list of where the disagreements are, where the president and Democrats do not agree. First, relief for the unemployed. House Democrats feel that must be much more robust. Schools, food aid, that's another one. States and cities. And then there's another dozen or so on that list. So there was a large gap. And to say that they were right on the edge of an agreement is not accurate. However, they were continuing to talk. Now I think that it is, Speaker Pelosi has offered that airline deal. However, it's up to the White House to accept her terms for that, the way she wants that to work. She now is waiting to see if the White House will get back to her on that. Everything else, Judy, Democrats really don't have a lot of motivation for re-engaging with this president who keeps shifting positions.
So let's turn to tonight's debate. Yamiche, we are just a few hours away from the only vice presidential debate of this election. Tell us what is known about Vice President Pence's strategy here.
Well, Vice President Pence is taking a more traditional look at debate prep. He was doing mock debates. He had someone playing Senator Harris. And his number one issue is going to be defending the president's response to the coronavirus. He's coming, of course, as the vice president, but he's also coming as the head of the coronavirus task force. So he's going to really be trying to make the case that they did all that they possibly can. Another thing to note is that he's going to have some guests in the crowd. He's going to have the parents of Kayla Mueller. She was a young woman who was killed by ISIS. So he's also going to be making the case that terrorism and foreign policy should also be on the minds of Americans in the middle of this pandemic.
And to Lisa, from the Democrats' side, Biden and Harris, what have you learned about what Harris's strategy is tonight?
Right. Harris will have to do a few things, obviously defend her own record. In addition to that, talk about Vice President Biden and his record. But we do expect her to be firm and aggressive and perhaps in talking about the coronavirus task force that Vice President Pence has chaired. I also think that what the Biden campaign is hoping, perhaps more than anything, is that Harris can break through kind of the weariness that a lot of voters feel right now about politics, and that she can connect with voters on a personal level. We saw her ability to do that in the primary debates. So I think we should expect her to talk about personal experiences.
And finally, a different subject, yet another subject, Yamiche, and that is there was news today out of the Centers for Disease Control. Tell us about that.
That's right. A former director of the CDC wrote a letter to the current director of the CDC, essentially telling him that he should orchestrate his own firing to call attention to what he sees as undue political pressure coming out of the White House and onto the CDC. William Fauci wrote in part that the president essentially should be called out for pushing the CDC to do things that are not right when it comes to science. Now, William Fauci is someone who is seen as a public health expert. He's someone who worked on smallpox and other issues. We don't have a graphic up, but I want to read part of what he said, which is it's a slaughter, not just a political dispute. So what he was talking about there is the coronavirus pandemic, essentially saying that too many Americans have died and this administration has really not done what it needed to do for the virus. So as a result, he's saying that the CDC really needs to be calling out the president and that the director should be the one speaking up.
So important to hear that. Yamiche Alcindor for us reporting on the White House, Lisa Desjardins reporting on the Capitol and the Biden campaign. Thank you both.